The subtle signs that whispered louder than his words began long before the truth came crashing down on me, and at first, I didn't even recognize them for what they were. They seemed like little things, harmless shifts that could easily be explained away if I wanted to believe hard enough. A new habit of holding his phone just a little tighter, angling the screen away from me as if the light might blind me if I looked too closely. A sudden busyness at work, meetings that stretched far longer than they ever had before, the occasional business trip that left me questioning why they had become so frequent. When you live with someone, when you know their rhythms, their tones, the way they carry themselves in moments of comfort, it is impossible not to feel when something slips out of sync. I told myself not to overthink, not to turn into the kind of person who invents problems where none exist, but denial has a way of cushioning us until the cracks are too big to ignore. The way he smiled changed, too. It was still there, still familiar, but not quite mine anymore. It was softer, more distracted, like his mind was half a step away even in the middle of our conversations. I would ask him about his day, and instead of detailed stories or small complaints, I got vague responses, an almost scripted tone that left me feeling like I was talking to a stranger wearing the face of my husband. Nights grew quieter, not because we had run out of things to say, but because his attention was no longer in the room with me. He'd scroll, he'd text, he'd slip out for quick calls, and I'd sit there telling myself he was just tired, just stressed, just dealing with life in his own way. But silence, when it replaces connection, becomes the loudest signal of all. There were physical signs, too, the kind you wish you could dismiss, but can't. A faint trace of perfume that was not mine clinging to his clothes after late nights out. The way he suddenly started dressing with more care, ironing shirts that had once been thrown on casually, picking colognes he hadn't worn in years. Even his gym routine shifted, a sudden discipline about his appearance that might have been admirable if it didn't come hand in hand with the widening emotional distance between us. These weren't just changes, they were clues, fragments of a puzzle I didn't want to put together. Because putting it together meant admitting what I feared, and then there was his phone, the device that suddenly became more sacred than any family heirloom. Once left casually on the table, unlocked and forgotten, it was now always at his side, face down, password protected with urgency. If I asked to borrow it, he'd hand it over with a hesitation too slight for anyone else to notice, but glaringly obvious to me. Notifications silenced, calls answered in another room, laughter I wasn't part of. The whispers weren't in words, they were in behaviors, small enough to deny, but sharp enough to wound. My gut twisted every time, telling me the truth I didn't want to face. Intuition is cruel in that way. It knows before you do. It pushes before you're ready as explanations fit together like mismatched puzzle pieces. Long hours, sudden work dinners, trips that came out of nowhere. He became careful with details, too careful, because lies always try to wrap themselves in neat bows, but reality is rarely that tidy. He'd tell me he was exhausted, but his eyes carried a spark that exhaustion doesn't create. He'd say he was with colleagues, but his stories held no names, no moments, no slip-ups that usually pepper honest retellings. I noticed the void, the blankness where life should have been shared, and it left me uneasy in ways I couldn't quite silence, and yet, I wanted to believe him. That was the cruelest part. My love for him, my trust in what we had built, made me complicit in ignoring what was plain to see. I smoothed over inconsistencies, reminded myself of his better days, convinced myself I was imagining things. Because if I admitted it, if I let myself believe the whispers of doubt, I would have to admit that the life we had together wasn't as solid as I thought. Hope became my defense, but hope can be dangerous when it's built on denial. Every little sign became a battle between my heart and my instincts, and every time I chose to believe him, I lost a little piece of myself. What I didn't realize then was how those small signs, those subtle whispers, were not just signals of his betrayal, but warnings of the storm to come. They were the first cracks in the mask he wore, the early tremors before the ground gave way beneath me. They were telling me a story he wouldn't, a story I wasn't ready to hear, but one that would eventually tear its way into the open whether I wanted it to or not. The moment of discovery came not with a dramatic revelation, not with a loud confrontation or an obvious slip-up, but with something so ordinary it almost felt surreal. It was late afternoon, the sun filtering weakly through the curtains, and I had been tidying up the living room while he showered upstairs. His phone, the device that had grown into a vault of secrets, buzzed on the table. Normally, I would have left it untouched, reminding myself of boundaries and trust, but something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the sheer accumulation of doubts that had been pressing against me for weeks. Maybe it was the faint tremor in my chest that whispered I already knew. The screen lit up, and without hesitation, my eyes flicked toward it. What I saw froze me in place. It wasn't a suspicious name or a cryptic message, but something unmistakably intimate, words laced with affection, words that had once been mine but were now addressed to someone else. My breath caught, a lump forming in my throat as my hands trembled. I didn't pick the phone up at first, as if not touching it might make the message disappear, as if my silence could undo what I had just seen. But curiosity mixed with dread, and within seconds I was scrolling, my fingers shaking so badly I thought I might drop the device. Message after message painted a picture that left no room for doubt. Plans made in secrecy, stolen moments wrapped in flirtation, promises whispered in text bubbles. Each word was a dagger, each emoji a cruel confirmation. I could almost hear his voice in those messages, the same voice that had told me he loved me, the same tone he had used to comfort me on hard days, now directed toward someone else. Betrayal wasn't just in the content of the words, it was in the familiarity of them, the realization that the intimacy I thought was sacred had been replicated and shared. The air around me felt heavy, pressing down as though the walls themselves were witnesses to my heartbreak. My body went cold, yet my face burned with the flush of humiliation. It wasn't just the affair that hurt, it was the certainty that he thought I would never know, that he believed his lies were clever enough, his act convincing enough. I sat there, staring at proof I hadn't wanted but now couldn't unsee, the reality of it crashing down harder than any suspicion ever had. Doubt leaves space for denial, but evidence leaves no escape. I felt anger rise like fire in my chest, quickly smothered by waves of sadness, then replaced again by rage. The emotions came in violent bursts, colliding until I could barely breathe. I remember the sound of the shower running upstairs, the water masking his unknowing presence, while I sat downstairs drowning in the truth. It was almost absurd, the normalcy of the moment clashing with the chaos unraveling inside me. He was upstairs rinsing off the day, humming softly as if nothing in the world had shifted, while downstairs his carefully crafted reality shattered in my hands. That contrast, the way life seemed so ordinary while my heart split open, etched itself into my memory more vividly than anything else. It was the cruel reminder that betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder, it slips in quietly, disguised in the everyday, until suddenly it consumes everything. As I continued to scroll, the messages blurred through my tears, but the meaning was clear enough. They had inside jokes, shared references, even photos that made my stomach churn. She wasn't just a distraction. She was someone he had carved time and space for, someone he had prioritized enough to weave into his life with intention. And what struck me most was the ease with which he had done it. The way he had moved between two worlds, ours and theirs, with such seamless deceit. I realized then that I hadn't just been blind, I had been willingly kept in the dark, lulled by the hope that my marriage was stronger than any doubt. My chest tightened, and I pressed the phone back onto the table as if it had burned me. I sat in silence, staring at it, waiting for my breathing to steady, waiting for some kind of numbness to replace the ache. But numbness didn't come. Instead, every detail around me seemed sharper, crueler. The framed photos on the wall mocked me with frozen smiles from a life that now felt counterfeit. The blanket draped over the couch, one we had picked out together, suddenly felt foreign beneath my fingers. Even the clock ticking on the wall seemed louder, each second marking the time before and after I knew the truth. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, stepped into knowledge I could never unlearn. What I remember most vividly about that moment wasn't just the proof of his betrayal, but the clarity it brought. All the subtle signs, all the nagging doubts, all the whispers I had tried to silence were suddenly validated. The gut feeling I had buried beneath layers of love and denial had been right all along. And though the truth broke me, it also stripped away the lies, leaving me standing in a reality I could no longer ignore. The storm of emotions that followed my discovery was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A tidal wave crashing over me again and again without giving me a chance to breathe. At first, there was shock, a numbness that settled in my bones as if my body was trying to protect me from the weight of the truth. I sat there frozen, staring into nothing, my mind replaying the messages I had just read in endless loops. The words weren't just letters on a screen anymore, they were echoes that seemed to seep into every corner of my heart, leaving behind bruises I couldn't see but could feel with every heartbeat. My stomach churned, my throat tightened, and I felt both frozen and on fire at the same time, caught between disbelief and the undeniable evidence that had been staring back at me when the numbness cracked. Anger erupted like a storm breaking free after being caged too long. It wasn't the kind of quiet frustration you bury deep down. It was wild, consuming, filling every corner of me with heat. My hands clenched, my chest pounded, my mind screamed questions I knew I wouldn't get answers to. How could he? Why would he? What was I lacking that drove him into someone else's arms? The anger wasn't just at him, it turned inward too, sharp and unforgiving. How had I not seen it sooner? How had I let myself believe his excuses, his half-smiles, his careful lies? The fury lashed out in every direction, sparing no one, not even myself, but anger never stays alone. It was quickly tangled with grief, a sorrow so deep it hollowed me out. I cried until I had no sound left, tears streaming silently while my body shook with the ache of loss. It wasn't just the loss of him I mourned, it was the loss of the life I thought I had, the trust one thought was unbreakable, the love I believed was ours alone. Every memory we had built together twisted painfully in my mind, tainted now by the knowledge that while I was holding on to us, he was giving pieces of himself to someone else. Birthdays, anniversaries, little jokes whispered in the dark, all of it felt like it had been stolen from me, robbed of its meaning. The grief was heavier than I could carry, and yet there it was, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. Humiliation crept in next, sharp and merciless. I replayed every interaction with him in my head, wondering how many times he had looked me in the eye while holding this secret behind his smile. I thought of the people around us, friends, family, strangers, had they known? Had they seen something I had missed? The embarrassment was suffocating, as though a spotlight had been thrown onto my life, exposing me as the fool who had trusted too much. I hated that I cared what others might think, but betrayal has a way of stripping pride down to its bare bones. I felt small, diminished, as though the betrayal had branded me with a scar everyone else could see. Confusion wrapped itself around everything, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. My mind spun in circles, trying to piece together a timeline, searching for clues I had overlooked. When had it started? Was it when he became distant, or had it been long before? Were the vacations we shared real moments of love, or were they performances to keep me complacent? Every smile, every kiss, every gesture of affection became suspect in hindsight, as though I were rewinding through years of our life only to find cracks where I had once seen perfection. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if nothing I had believed could be trusted anymore, and then came fear, a quiet but relentless shadow. Fear of the future, of what this meant for the life we had built, the home we had created. Fear of the conversations to come, of the confrontation I knew was inevitable. Fear of starting over, of being alone, of not knowing who I was without him. The betrayal had stripped me of more than trust. It had taken away the security I thought I had, leaving me standing on the edge of uncertainty, staring into a future that felt both terrifying and empty. The storm didn't move in a straight line. It circled back on itself, unpredictable and cruel. One moment I was seething, ready to tear everything apart in rage, and the next I was collapsed in silence, drowning in sadness so heavy it felt like it would swallow me whole. There were times when I felt detached, almost watching myself from the outside, as if the pain belonged to someone else, and I was just a spectator. But then a word, a memory, a glance at his belongings would pull me back in, reminding me that this was my reality, my heartbreak, my storm to weather. What made it all worse was the lack of release. Confrontation might have given me an outlet, but in those first hours and days, I held it inside, carrying the weight alone. Every smile I forced, every normal task I completed, every interaction I had with him while pretending I didn't know was another layer of torment. It was a private chaos, a storm raging beneath the surface while the outside world saw only calm. That dissonance, the contrast between my inner world and the mask I wore, deepened the emotional turmoil until it felt endless, a cycle I couldn't escape. The decision to stop being the silent victim was not made in a single flash of clarity, but rather in the quiet accumulation of sleepless nights, tear-stained pillows, and the growing realization that silence was slowly destroying me more than his betrayal ever could. For days, I carried the knowledge of his affair like a secret weight pressed against my chest, suffocating me in ways I couldn't explain. I went through the motions of daily life, cooked meals, smiled when expected, responded politely to conversations, but underneath it all, I was unraveling. Every time I swallowed my hurt, every time I told myself to wait, every time I pretended not to know, I felt myself shrinking. My identity as a wife, as a woman, as a person with dignity and worth, was dissolving into the background noise of his deception. That realization was the seed that grew into something stronger, something fiercer than fear. At first, I tried to convince myself that silence was strength, that keeping the peace was a way of holding on to control. But deep down, I knew I wasn't protecting peace. I was protecting his comfort, allowing him to carry on while I bore the weight of his choices alone. The more I thought about it, the more anger began to burn beneath the surface, not just at him but at myself. Why was I allowing his betrayal to define my behavior? Why was I protecting him from the consequences of his actions while I silently drowned in pain? That question became louder every day until it was impossible to ignore. My silence wasn't making me strong, it was making me complicit, and that was a truth I could no longer live with. I started to observe him differently after that realization. Every lie he told, every excuse he gave, every moment he slipped away into the shadows of his phone or his supposed obligations, I stopped seeing through the eyes of a wounded spouse and started seeing through the eyes of someone reclaiming her power. His words no longer carried the same weight. His presence no longer held the same authority. Instead, I saw a man who had underestimated me, who had mistaken my love for blindness, who believed my silence was weakness. The more I recognized that, the more determined I became to show him that I wasn't the passive figure he thought I was. My silence was ending, and with it, the illusion he had carefully built. Deciding to speak up, to confront, to act, was terrifying. The fear of what would happen next gnawed at me constantly. What if confronting him meant the end of everything we had built? What if he walked away without remorse, leaving me alone with nothing but the ruins of our marriage? What if I shattered the fragile stability I had left, the roof over my head, the life I had grown comfortable in? These questions haunted me, but alongside them came another thought that was even more powerful. What if staying silent meant losing myself entirely? The truth was already known, the betrayal already real. My silence wasn't saving me from pain, it was chaining me to it. And I realized then that I would rather face the uncertainty of confrontation than the slow death of being complicit in my own suffering. The turning point came in the mirror one night. I stood there, staring at my reflection, eyes swollen from crying, shoulders slumped under invisible weight, and I barely recognized myself. Where was the woman who had dreams, who had strength, who once demanded respect from the world around her? All I saw was someone fading, dimmed by the lies of a man who no longer valued her. And in that moment, a thought hit me with piercing clarity. If I didn't fight for myself, no one else would. He wasn't going to hand me back my dignity. I would have to take it back. That shift in mindset was subtle, but powerful. The moment where victimhood cracked and determination seeped through. From that point on, every thought, every action, every plan was guided by one truth: I would not stay silent anymore. I began rehearsing the words I would say, not in desperation, but in defiance. I thought about the look in his eyes when he realized I knew, when he realized his carefully constructed world had come undone. I thought about the way my voice would no longer tremble, the way my presence would no longer bend under the weight of his lies. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. I wasn't just confronting him to expose his betrayal, I was confronting him to remind myself of who I was, of the strength I still carried. Of the dignity I refused to lose. The silence that had once protected him was broken in my mind long before it broke in reality. With every passing day, I grew stronger, my fear slowly being replaced by resolve. I wasn't just reacting to his affair anymore. I was choosing how I would define myself in the aftermath. I was no longer the silent victim sitting in the shadows of his lies. I was the woman stepping into the light, unafraid of the consequences, ready to reclaim her story. The bold move of crashing their vacation was not something I had planned in advance. Not a carefully crafted strategy designed to humiliate him, but rather the culmination of every sleepless night, every unanswered question, and every burning ache that had lived in my chest since the day I discovered his betrayal. It began with a spark, the thought that if he could plan a getaway with her, pretending it was business or obligation, then I could take control of the very narrative he thought he owned. The lies he fed me about needing time away for work became the very rope he unknowingly handed me, and instead of letting him escape into the comfort of his deception, I chose to follow the trail and confront him where he least expected it. It wasn't just about catching him red-handed, it was about reclaiming the power he thought he had stripped from me. Tracking the details was easier than I imagined. He had become so careless, so confident in my silence, that the clues were scattered in plain sight. A half-hidden itinerary on the counter, an email that slipped through without him realizing I saw, a casual comment about flights that didn't quite match the work excuse he had given me. He thought I wasn't paying attention, but betrayal sharpens perception in ways love never does. Each breadcrumb he left became part of the trail I pieced together, and soon enough, I had enough to know exactly where he was going and when. My heart raced as I booked my own ticket, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and grim satisfaction pulsing through me. I wasn't just traveling to a destination, I was traveling into the very heart of the lie he had constructed. The journey itself felt surreal, a haze of emotions swirling with every passing mile. On the plane, I stared out the window, my reflection a blur against the darkened sky, and wondered how I had gotten here, how the woman who once trusted so freely was now flying across borders to confront the very man she had promised forever to. There was a quiet strength in that realization, though, because while he was expecting me to remain ignorant, I was already rewriting the ending. My pulse quickened at the thought of the moment I would walk in, of the look on his face when he realized I wasn't the passive, blind partner he had taken me for. The fear of what might happen next was real, but it was eclipsed by the anticipation of shattering the illusion he had so carefully built. When I arrived at the hotel, the reality of it hit harder than I expected. The lobby was warm, filled with the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle hum of lives unburdened by betrayal. I checked in under my own name, my hands trembling slightly as I held the keycard, the plastic rectangle that would open the door to the truth. Every step toward that room was a battle between nerves and determination, each hallway echoing with the sound of my heartbeat. I paused at his door, the number etched in my memory from the itinerary I had seen, and took a deep breath. This was the threshold between silence and revelation, between victimhood and empowerment. I raised my hand, and instead of knocking timidly, I slid the key into the lock and turned it with a steadiness that surprised even me. The moment the door swung open, time seemed to slow. There they were, the two of them, framed by the false intimacy of a vacation that had been built on lies. His expression morphed instantly from confusion to horror, hers from surprise to shame, and in that instant, I felt something shift inside me. I had expected to feel only rage, to explode with the fury that had been burning within me for weeks, but instead what I felt was clarity. The power dynamic had flipped. He was no longer the one in control, no longer the man who could hide behind half-truths and excuses. I stood there, uninvited yet completely rightful, owning the space he had tried to reserve for his betrayal. The silence that followed was thick, but it was no longer my silence to bear. It was his, heavy and choking as he scrambled for words that would never be enough. What unfolded after that was not about theatrics or screaming matches, though the emotions inside me roared with intensity. It was about presence, about the undeniable fact that I had claimed back the truth he thought I would never touch. Every look exchanged in that room, every stammered attempt he made to explain, Every guilty glance she cast toward the floor was a testament to the strength it had taken me to get there. I didn't need to destroy them with words. The fact that I stood there, unbroken, was enough. The vacation he had painted as an escape had become the very stage for his downfall, and I was no longer the woman left behind at home waiting for scraps of affection. I was the woman who walked into the fire and refused to be consumed walking out of that room later. I carried something heavier than relief, but lighter than the crushing weight of silence. I hadn't just confronted his betrayal, I had confronted my own fear, my own hesitation, my own tendency to stay quiet in the face of pain. Crashing their vacation wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming space, reclaiming voice, reclaiming the part of me that he thought he had silenced. And in that bold move, I reminded myself that even in the face of heartbreak, even when deception tries to write your story for you, there is always the choice to take the pen back. The power of reclaiming dignity when deception tries to steal it does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, in small breaths of realization that build upon each other until they become a steady rhythm. At first, dignity felt like something I had lost completely, as if his betrayal had stripped me of it and left me bare before the world. I felt humiliated, discarded, replaced, as though I had been measured against someone else and found unworthy. But dignity is not something another person can truly take. It is something we surrender when we believe their lies are stronger than our truth. It took time for me to see that, but when I did, I understood that reclaiming my dignity meant refusing to let his choices define who I was. It began in the smallest acts of defiance, moments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but were monumental to me. Holding my head high in a room when all I wanted to do was collapse. Meeting his eyes without flinching when he tried to spin excuses into explanations. Speaking words that trembled but carried truth, refusing to swallow them back down in fear of how they might be received. Each act was like a stitch, sewing back together the parts of me that betrayal had tried to unravel. I realized that dignity wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending I wasn't broken. It was about standing in that brokenness without shame and declaring that I was still whole in the ways that mattered. What gave me strength was the understanding that deception thrives in silence, in shadows, in the spaces where it believes it can manipulate and control. By crashing his lies into the open, by refusing to be the quiet, complicit partner, I had already begun the process of reclaiming myself. He had counted on my silence, on my fear, on my desire to keep the image of our life intact. But dignity is found in truth, and once I stepped into it, there was no going back. I no longer cared if the truth shattered the facade we had built together, because what use is a life built on deception? My worth was not tied to preserving his image. My worth was tied to honoring myself. The more I leaned into this, the more clarity I gained. I began to see that dignity wasn't about how others viewed me. It wasn't about saving face or protecting appearances. It was about the private, unshakable knowledge that I had faced betrayal without letting it reduce me to something smaller. Even in the moments where my voice shook, even in the moments where tears blurred my vision, I reminded myself that strength isn't measured by the absence of pain, but by the refusal to let pain define the entirety of who you are. He could break promises, he could shatter trust, but he could not destroy the core of my identity unless I handed it to him. There were moments when it felt easier to sink back into the role of the victim, to let the weight of heartbreak convince me I was powerless. But every time I chose to stand, even shakily, I felt a piece of that dignity return. It was in walking out of rooms with my head unbowed. It was in refusing to let my life become a stage for his lies. It was in rediscovering my voice, sharp and clear, where once it had been quiet and hesitant. And it was in realizing that my story didn't end with his betrayal, it only changed shape. Reclaiming dignity meant refusing to let his actions become the final definition of me. The most profound part of this process was the shift in how I saw myself. For so long, I had viewed myself through the lens of what he gave me, his attention, his love, his validation. When those things were taken away, I felt stripped of value. But slowly, I began to rebuild the mirror through which I saw my reflection. I was not defined by his lies. I was not lessened by his choices. I was not unworthy simply because he sought someone else. My dignity was mine to carry, mine to protect, and mine to reclaim. And when I finally embraced that, I realized that no one, not even someone I once trusted with my heart, had the power to take it from me. Reclaiming dignity is not about revenge or proving a point to the one who wronged you. It is about choosing yourself when someone else has failed to. It is about standing in the ashes of what was destroyed and realizing you are still standing. It is about walking forward without dragging their lies behind you like chains. In reclaiming my dignity, I found not only strength but freedom. The freedom to live unburdened by the weight of his deception. The freedom to redefine what love and respect mean to me. The freedom to rise where betrayal tried to bury me.